This is Dr. Dave Mastak talking about reciprocity.com, the sharing economy proofreading platform that I am trying to build. And I really wanted to talk about the need for proofreading and getting proofreading help online today. And I really wanted to actually talk about language being living and creative and changing and doing all these wonderful things. I think it's amazing. And this is one particular reason why I actually created Reciprocity. As I was thinking about this as I was building it, because I know as my understanding, so I'm a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship in a business school, and I know that things change. Things are very, very dynamic, and they're constantly changing. This one thing that we actually do study in that field is we study sort of the evolution of things changing over time. And one thing that I do know that changes very rapidly and it's constantly changing and it's very, very dynamic is language. It is constantly evolving. There's new words popping up on a daily basis. Every day that there is something new. There's new expressions that are coming out, new meanings. What's really cool is that the same word can undertake a different meaning at different times. It is constantly evolving, and as well as different ways of compounding and connecting the different words over time. There's so many amazing things, and that's really what I wanted to talk about today is the different sort of ways that language may change, as well as sort of the impact on why it's really difficult to actually use any sort of rule-based software systems, spell check or grammar checks type systems. And I think that this actually will explain this, because I think the human mind is one of the most amazing things out there. There are so many really cool things that happen that we can do. And that's one thing that I do really realize about. So one of the topics I do study and think about is creativity. And I do think about all the things that are so miraculous and is so cool and changes in your mind that allows us to grow and proliferate and create all these really wonderful, cool things that we never had in the past. And language is definitely one of those things. It's actually becoming a more popular topic, and how language changes and we sort of perceive sort of different categories of things over time. There is a little sentence I put into the show notes. I want you to take a look at it and tell me if you can actually read this. I'm going to get you to look at it right now. Now that you looked at it and you took a look at it, you might be thinking that, wow, I can't read this, but I want you to process it a little bit more right now. Now, what you will notice is that you can read it, because what you're able to do, even though it's all jarbled up and it doesn't make a lot of sense, in fact, there was a meme that went around a few years ago with this very wording that was in that, showing you that you can actually process things that don't make a lot of sense. And a computer would not be able to process this. Any sort of rule-based system that's currently available, whether it's machine learning or not, wouldn't be able to process this very, very well. There are some sort of crowdsourcing applications that might be able to do this, but it's not quite in the same area. But I want you to think about this. The reason why you're able to process this is that the human mind is amazing at pattern recognition and image recognition. It can go through, because what ends up happening is you have experiences, you have thousands, if not millions of experiences of seeing the same words over and over and over and over and over again. And sometimes they're mismatched, sometimes they're in different order, sometimes they're all just kind of, maybe somebody wrote something in one way and it should mean the other way. So our mind is really plastic. We can sort of put things together and make sense of different words that don't quite make a lot of sense, and they're kind of jarbled together, and process things. And then when you take it to the extreme, right, if you take it to the very extreme that you have seen this thousands of times over again, and there's kind of been little manipulations all throughout, all of the times that you've seen it, maybe not 75% of the time you've seen the word in the right way, but then sometimes there's differences, right? Even if you think of written work or handwriting, you have to look at it. Everybody has their own unique handwriting, but there is some sort of constant theme behind that. And your brain is really good at processing this stuff and putting it together. That's why you can process this and make sense of it. And in fact, it's probably easier to look at this than it is handwriting because you have sort of the structure behind it. And even with handwriting, it's so messy. Even if you see somebody's handwriting that isn't like a doctor's handwriting, right? Even though it's incredibly messy, you could still make sense of it. And in fact, what's really interesting is that sometimes it gets so messy that only somebody that has been exposed to that person's handwriting can actually process it on a regular basis, right? So the pharmacist can understand the doctor's writing, but nobody else can understand what they're saying or writing, which is really neat. That's because our human mind is so much into processing and so much into pattern recognition. We can see things that are really, really peculiar. So any sort of rule-based software, any sort of, things that are, and I'm not going to name them because they're amazing. I do use stuff like this all the time, the rule-based software, but it only picks up things so much. And any sort of these sort of spell check things and stuff like that, they're only going to pick up a certain amount of issues that are going on with your particular text because it can't process as well. It can't do the pattern recognition as human brains can do, right? We are extremely good at making sense of the world and making sense of a really jargly, kind of messed up world that a lot of other like software can't do, because what software is essentially people thinking up what are the predefined rules of how something works, and then they write it into the software of how something works. But the world as we know it is not predefined. Things change, it's dynamic, it's constantly evolving, and our mind is constantly forecasting where these changes will be over time, right? So here's a really another cool thing. So that is just the spelling and how it's written out and how we're processing it. But here's the really cool thing is that the underlying meaning behind each word is changing. That blows my mind too. It is changing over time. So if you want to think, and the reason why it changes over time is that we communicate with other people, right? So communication is not the static thing at all. So when you communicate with other people, you are making subtle deviations and subtle changes over time. These subtle changes can be picked up by somebody else processing it. They're making sense of what's going on, but these subtle changes sort of evolve. So you might make a subtle change, the other person might pick up on that little tiny change, and then they might actually start doing that. And then somebody else, they pass on that knowledge to other people, and there's a subtle deviation that happens over time. And pretty soon language has shifted its meaning. That's why if you watch or you listen to a Shakespearean play, that in the language of the time, hundreds of years ago, that would have made sense. It would have been like, oh yeah, I know what's going on, right? Like it's so clear and plain as day. But now when you go and read it, you can't make sense of it at all. It doesn't make any sense because your language has shifted over time and the meanings behind words has shifted over time, that it makes it really difficult to understand what's going on. If you've seen something from even 50 years ago, even 100 years ago, if you read the text from 100 years ago, 50 years ago, it is different. They have different meanings behind different things. So one sort of good example of this, or a couple of good examples, you could say, that's bad, right? This sort of a trite one, that's bad. Or, that is bad. That is really cool, right? The thing that you're doing. The other one is I can say, oh yeah, I'm awesome, right? Or I can, after I make a mistake and I sort of blunder, I'd be like, oh geez, I'm awesome, right? So that is and we have different meanings of how that is. And you can see even the I'm awesome example, depending on what actually happens and what people say beforehand, it is really clear on what the meaning is. And so it's constantly changing over time, and we need to understand the sort of broader text and everything underlying what's going on before you can actually make a sort of judgment on what you're saying and what you're doing. So it's really good to have somebody else, a human, another person out there, sort of process and make sense of it, because they can look at the entire text and they can say, ooh, I know exactly what you're talking about here. This is why, instead of saying this, I would actually say that instead, right? So And that's getting in more, a little bit more into editing, which is great. And that's why I'm kind of blurring the lines between editing and proofreading here, because proofreading is more just picking up sort of minor issues, but editing is going to pick up sort of the more major issues with what's going on with the language. And that's where another pair of eyes can actually do an amazing job and pick up things that other people can't pick up. So here's the other really cool thing. It's not just over time that language is changing and evolving and subtly changing. It is because we're doing these sort of interactions between like-minded people and people that are all in the same sort of group. It is changing within the geography. So even within the same country, right, there are subtle changes in language over in different geographic regions, right? So this is really cool. I grew up in North Minnesota in Northern Ontario, and we have a different language in how we speak about things than somebody else from Southern Ontario or somebody else from like the Detroit area, right? So there were subtle differences that I was able to pick up. So one of them, I don't know if you've ever done this, is that whenever you take somebody out swinging, going for, swinging, then sometimes you can run underneath of them to give them an extra push when they're swinging on that swing set. Well, I call it an underdog. I was raised calling it an underdog, but somebody else from a different region calls it an underduck. That subtle change makes a big difference, right, in how we understand that. Another thing is we used to drink soda pop, right? We never called it soda pop. I always called it pop. But in the region right there, and lots of people like from Wisconsin and Minnesota and Northern Ontario, we call it pop. But then other people call it soda pop, and other people in different regions call it cola. Other people call it Coke. Right, so there's all sorts of different changes and sort of different meanings, and we have different meanings what that is, right? So if I said pop, and if I say that, so I'm in Florida. If I say pop, people they can't make sense of that. Another one is, so I was born and raised in Canada. We say washroom, and washroom for a restroom or a bathroom is the polite way of saying, can I go to the washroom? It's very, very much more polite than saying, can I go to the bathroom, right? So when I say that down here, when I'm in Florida or in the US, people don't understand what I'm talking about. They look at me like I have four heads that I'm saying washroom. And so these subtle changes are really interesting, and they depend on the geographic region and all that. And it very much is sort of dependent within the different areas. And so what's really cool is even though you might have somebody in the sort of specialty area, you still need to get somebody that's within a geographic region to understand the context of what you're actually saying. So that's what I'm trying to build out with reciprocity, is this idea of, it's kind of like a matchmaking or a dating website where you can find people, because the world is really cool and there's people all over the world and they're all doing unique and different things. We can match them. I can hopefully build some sort of software that can, and it's running right now. It's rudimentary. But you could build something that matches people really closely depending on what their region is that they grew up in, for example, as well as what they are, what they're studying, what they understand. We can understand, just like on dating websites, we can match them really well. We can match people really well. And they're going to have a much better understanding of the world, and going to have a much better understanding of what you're trying to say and communicate. And they might have a different way of communicating that to your audience, which is really difficult. And that's not going to be able to be done with any sort of rule-based system or rule-based software that's out there. So that's all I wanted to say. Hopefully you found this interesting and really cool. I really wanted to talk about this sort of living language idea, and that is constantly changing, and it depends on not only the time that you have or the time of when you're talking about things, but as well as the region that you're in. And the difficulty of sort of rule-based systems, it's very much this kind of backwards looking perspective where it records, when you have a rule-based system, it records things that we have done in the past. It doesn't forecast the future. And that's what humans do. They can look at the language and see how it's evolving, and they can forecast what is going to be the next actions, what are going to be the next thing that people are going to say, what are they going to write, and then we can process that a lot more depending on what they've written in the past, which is really, really cool perspective, I think. And that's why I'm trying to build that and create this sort of reciprocity project, or one major reason why I'm trying to create it, because I think it's a cool tool and it's going to benefit a lot of people. So that's all I wanted to say. You could look at the other videos of what I'm trying to do with this particular project. It is going to help out a lot of people, not only writers and people that need the help, but also editors. And I really do want to help out graduate students with this. So you can see what I'm trying to do with the older videos with that. So that's all I want to say. If you like this video, do the old thumbs up. If you didn't like it, and that's fine too. You can also subscribe to the YouTube channel. I do appreciate it. Everybody who's subscribed, you're so cool. You're amazing. Thank you so much. Have a good day, and I'm really, really looking forward to seeing you on the next video. Take care.